The intersection of hope and prejudice. Angela Carter strode down Harmony Avenue, her arms laden with boxes of art supplies. The warm afternoon sun bathed the sidewalks of East Briarwood, a neighborhood fighting to stay afloat in a sea of neglect. Cracks in the pavement, boarded-up storefronts, and faded murals told the story of a community both proud and struggling. Angela was a beacon of hope in this community, known for her relentless efforts to uplift its youth and fight systemic injustices. The sound of laughter rang out from a nearby park where a group of children played basketball. Angela smiled, drawing energy from their joy. She thought about the art program she had tirelessly organized at the local community center, believing it could offer these kids an outlet for their frustrations and dreams. Her steps quickened, driven by the hope of completing her errands and returning to oversee the final preparations. The bell above Patel's corner store jingled as Angela pushed through the door, her smile widening at the sight of Mr. Patel behind the counter. His kind eyes lit up, reflecting the familiarity of decades spent serving the neighborhood. "Mrs. Carter, always good to see you," he greeted in his melodic Indian accent, setting down his book. "I assume you're here for the supplies." Angela nodded, setting the boxes on the counter with a soft sigh of relief. "Yes, Mr. Patel. Thank you for holding these for me. The kids are going to love the new paints." As Patel began ringing up her items, Angela's gaze drifted to the window. Across the street, Officer Darren Wilkes leaned against his patrol car, his sharp eyes scanning the faces of pedestrians. Angela felt a familiar twinge of discomfort. Wilkes was known for his heavy-handed approach to policing in East Briarwood. Her encounters with him had been limited but unpleasant, laced with subtle remarks that betrayed his prejudice. "Trouble's brewing outside," Patel murmured, following her gaze. "That officer, he doesn't trust this community." Angela sighed. "It's not about trust. It's about control. But that's why we keep working, Mr. Patel, so these kids grow up knowing they're worth more than the stereotypes assigned to them." Patel nodded solemnly and handed her the receipt. "Be careful, Mrs. Carter, and give my regards to the youth center." Angela thanked him and stepped back onto the sun-dappled sidewalk, clutching the boxes tightly. As she maneuvered toward her car, Wilkes's eyes locked on her. He began walking in her direction, his hand resting casually on his belt, where his holstered firearm gleamed. "Excuse me, ma'am," Wilkes called out, his tone curt. "What's in those boxes?" Angela stopped and turned, her face calm, but her heart racing. "Good afternoon, officer. These are supplies for the Briarwood Youth Center." Wilkes's brow furrowed. "Supplies, huh? I'm going to need to see some identification and a receipt for those items." Angela's smile didn't falter, but a flicker of irritation crossed her eyes. "Of course, officer. Let me just set these down." As she bent to place the boxes on the pavement, Wilkes's hand twitched toward his holster. The movement was subtle but unmistakable, and Angela froze. Around them, a few passers-by slowed, sensing the tension. Among them was 17-year-old Malik Jones, a lanky teen Angela knew from the youth center. His phone was already in his hand, recording the interaction with wide eyes. "Hands where I can see them," Wilkes barked, his voice rising. The demand carried an edge of hostility that caused Angela's breath to hitch. "Officer," Angela began, her voice steady, "I'm just trying to comply with your request. There's no need for alarm." Wilkes stepped closer, his posture rigid. "Just follow instructions, no sudden moves." The weight of the neighborhood's collective gaze fell upon Angela as more people gathered, their murmurs growing louder. Angela slowly raised her hands, her composure unwavering despite the storm brewing in her chest. Malik edged closer, his phone capturing every second. "Officer, please," Angela said. "If you'll allow me to." "Don't talk back," Wilkes interrupted, grabbing her arm. The boxes tumbled to the ground, spilling art supplies onto the pavement. Gasps erupted from the crowd, and Malik's voice wavered as he whispered into his phone. The roughness of Wilkes's grip was shocking, his fingers digging into her skin. Angela's mind raced, recalling the countless times she had counseled the youth on how to de-escalate encounters like this. Now she found herself at the center of one, feeling both the weight of her advice and the bitterness of its irony. "Officer," she tried again, her voice firmer. "You're making a mistake. On the ground, now," Wilkes shouted, twisting her arm. The concrete scraped her cheek as she was forced onto the pavement. A murmur of outrage rippled through the crowd, which had now grown into a sea of concerned faces. Malik's phone trembled in his hand as he shouted. She didn't do anything. In the distance, sirens wailed, signaling the arrival of backup. Angela closed her eyes, the humiliation and anger threatening to overwhelm her. She knew this was more than a personal affront. It was an indictment of a system that had failed her community for generations. As the sirens grew louder, Angela opened her eyes and met Malik's tearful gaze. "Keep filming," she mouthed, her voice barely a whisper. When injustice echoes, the wail of sirens grew louder, filling the tense air as Angela remained face down on the unforgiving pavement. The rough scrape of concrete stung her cheek, and her heart thudded in her chest, but her resolve remained intact. She had endured far worse than this in her life. This moment, though humiliating and unjust, would not break her. "Stay down," Officer Wilkes barked, his voice shaking slightly. The aggressive command betrayed his uncertainty. He was used to control, not confrontation. Around them, the murmuring crowd had swelled into a chorus of discontent. Phones were raised, their cameras capturing the scene from every angle. Malik, now emboldened by the presence of others, moved closer. His voice trembled with righteous anger. "Let her go. She didn't do anything." Wilkes's gaze snapped to Malik, his hand hovering near his holster. "Back off, kid. This isn't your business." "This is all our business," shouted another voice from the crowd. It was Sheila, a local baker Angela had known for years. "That's Angela Carter. She's done more for this community than any of you ever have." Angela could hear the collective anger building, each voice amplifying the weight of the injustice she was enduring. She lifted her head slightly, enough to see Wilkes's jaw tighten as he glanced at the growing crowd. His control over the situation was slipping, and he knew it. The squad cars arrived with a screech of tires, and more officers spilled onto the scene. Detective Marcus Grant was the first to emerge, his sharp eyes scanning the chaos. A veteran officer known for his fair, no-nonsense approach, Grant had worked alongside Angela on community projects in the past. His stomach sank when he saw her on the ground, her face streaked with grit and determination. "Wilkes," Grant shouted as he approached. "What the hell is going on here?" She was resisting. Wilkes snapped, his grip still firm on Angela's arm. Grant's brow furrowed as he surveyed the scene. The spilled art supplies, the outraged crowd, and Malik's phone pointed squarely at them. He knelt beside Angela, his voice softer than Wilkes's but still commanding. "Angela, are you okay?" Angela's eyes met his, her voice calm but firm. "Detective Grant, this is an unnecessary and outrageous abuse of power. I have a receipt for those supplies, and I am not a criminal." Grant's gaze hardened as he turned to Wilkes. "Did you ask for her receipt?" Wilkes stammered, his bravado faltering under Grant's scrutiny. She made sudden movements. I had to act." "Sudden movements," Grant repeated incredulously. He gestured to the spilled paintbrushes and canvases. "Does this look like contraband to you? Let her go now." The crowd erupted in cheers as Wilkes reluctantly released Angela's arm. Grant helped her to her feet, brushing off her shoulders. "I'm sorry this happened, Angela," he said under his breath. "I'll handle this." But Angela shook her head. "This isn't just about me, Marcus. It's about what this community has endured for years." Her words were like a spark to dry tinder. The crowd's anger morphed into chants of solidarity. No justice, no peace. They roared, their voices carrying through the streets. Malik stepped forward, his phone still recording. "We're not letting this slide," he said, his youthful defiance cutting through the noise. "This isn't just about Mrs. Carter. This is about all of us." Grant raised his hands to calm the crowd. "We're going to sort this out. I need everyone to remain peaceful. Please, let us do our jobs." Angela interjected, her voice carrying a weight that silenced the crowd. "Detective Grant, I have no doubt you'll try to handle this, but the truth is, we've been told to stay peaceful for generations while nothing changes. Today that ends. Today, we demand accountability." The crowd erupted into cheers once more, and Grant knew he was losing control of the situation. He turned to one of the arriving officers. "Get her belongings, and check the receipt she mentioned." Now, as the officer hurried to comply, a sleek black sedan pulled up to the scene. The door opened, and out stepped Mayor Charles Carter, Angela's husband. His normally composed demeanor was replaced by a stormy intensity as he pushed through the crowd, his security detail struggling to keep up. "Angela," he called out, relief washing over his face when he saw her standing. He rushed to her side, gripping her hands tightly. "Are you hurt?" "I'm fine, Charles," she assured him, though her eyes betrayed the emotional toll of the encounter. "But this is far from over." Charles turned to Wilkes, his voice cold as steel. "You assaulted my wife. You humiliated a respected community leader in front of her neighbors. Do you realize what you've done?" Wilkes opened his mouth to respond, but no words came out. He was suddenly aware of just how high the stakes had become. Before Charles could continue, Malik's phone beeped, signaling the end of his live stream. Over 10,000 viewers just saw that. Malik announced, holding the phone high. "Everyone knows what happened here." The crowd roared their approval, their energy undeterred. Wilkes's face turned ashen as he realized the magnitude of the moment. It was no longer just about a single arrest. This had become a public reckoning. Grant stepped in, his voice firm. "Mayor Carter, I'll make sure this is investigated thoroughly. Wilkes will face the consequences." But Charles shook his head. "This isn't just about Wilkes. This is about a culture of impunity that has plagued this department for years. Tonight, the world is watching, and I intend to make sure they see change." Angela placed a hand on her husband's arm, her gaze steady and unwavering. "We will demand accountability, Charles, but we must also show them the strength of this community. This isn't just about punishment, it's about transformation." As she spoke, the rain began to fall, softening the heat of the day, but not the fire in the hearts of those gathered. The crowd began to disperse, their chants fading into the rhythm of the rain, but their resolve remained, stronger than ever. Angela turned to Malik and the others. "Tonight, we meet at the community center. We'll make a plan, together." Malik nodded, his youthful energy reinvigorated. "We'll be there, Mrs. Carter, all of us." As Angela and Charles walked toward their car, arm in arm, the rain washed away the day's dust, but not its scars. Angela's mind raced with thoughts of what was to come. This was only the beginning. The fight for justice had been reignited, and there was no turning back. The tipping point. The community center buzzed with a palpable energy that night, its modest walls straining to contain the voices of over 100 people. Rows of folding chairs had been hastily arranged, and every seat was filled. More people stood along the back wall and spilled out into the hallway, their faces a mosaic of anger, hope, and determination. Angela Carter stood at the front of the room, her hands gripping the edges of the lectern. Though the events of the afternoon had left her physically and emotionally drained, her resolve had only hardened. Her cheeks still bore the faint scrape from the pavement, a stark reminder of the injustice she'd faced. To her left, her husband, Mayor Charles Carter, sat with his arms crossed, his expression somber. On her right was Malik Jones, the young man whose recording of the incident had gone viral within hours. The video had been shared by activists, journalists, and celebrities alike, sparking a national conversation that extended far beyond East Briarwood. "Good evening, everyone," Angela began, her voice steady but tinged with emotion. The room quieted instantly, all eyes on her. Today, many of you witnessed what happened to me on Harmony Avenue. And while it was deeply humiliating and painful, it was not unique. Too many in our community have experienced the same kind of injustice, some far worse. A murmur of agreement rippled through the crowd. In the back, Sheila from the bakery nodded solemnly, her arms crossed over her chest. Angela continued, "What happened today wasn't just about me. It's about a broken system that has allowed officers like Darren Wilkes to target our community without accountability. It's about a culture that sees us as threats instead of neighbors, leaders, and contributors." The murmurs grew louder, voices echoing their shared frustration. Angela raised her hand for silence, her eyes scanning the room. "But tonight isn't about anger," she said. "It's about action. This moment, painful as it is, gives us an opportunity to demand change, not just for ourselves, but for our children and their children." Charles leaned in, his voice carrying the authority of his office. "The time for incremental reform has passed. We're calling for a full investigation into the practices of the Riverton Police Department. We will push for a civilian oversight board, increased funding for community programs, and mandatory de-escalation training for all officers." The room erupted into applause, but Angela raised her hand again, calming the crowd. "We also need to address our role in this change. Protesting is important. It sends a message. But we need to go beyond that. We need to organize. We need to vote. And we need to hold not just the police, but every institution in this city accountable." Malik stepped forward, his youthful energy adding a spark to the conversation. "Mrs. Carter is right," he said, his voice clear and impassioned. "I spent years thinking that nothing I did mattered. But today, when I picked up my phone and filmed what happened, I realized that's not true. We all have power. We just have to use it." Angela smiled at Malik, her pride evident. "Exactly, Malik. Each of us has a role to play in this fight. And I promise you, this fight is just beginning." The room erupted into applause once more, the collective energy electrifying. People rose to their feet, their voices rising in agreement. Plans were made that night. Marches, petitions, meetings with city officials. The people of East Briarwood were no longer willing to wait for change to come to them. They were going to make it happen. Meanwhile, at the police station, Officer Darren Wilkes sat in a small, dimly lit office at the Riverton Police Department. His uniform shirt was unbuttoned at the collar, and his face was pale and drawn. Across the desk from him sat Detective Marcus Grant and Sergeant David O'Connor, both regarding him with a mix of disappointment and frustration. "What the hell were you thinking, Darren?" O'Connor demanded, his voice sharp. "You assaulted the mayor's wife on a public street in front of half the neighborhood." Wilkes's jaw tightened. She was resisting. Grant leaned forward, his tone icy. "We've seen the video, Darren. She wasn't resisting. She was cooperating, and you escalated the situation unnecessarily." Wilkes shifted uncomfortably in his chair. "Look, I thought she was reaching for something. How was I supposed to know?" "By using common sense," O'Connor snapped. "You've been in this job long enough to know better. And now, because of your actions, this department is under a microscope." Grant folded his arms. "Do you understand the gravity of this? It's not just about you, Darren. It's about the trust, or lack thereof, between this department and the community we're supposed to serve." Wilkes's face flushed with anger. "That community hates us no matter what we do. You think they'd trust us if we gave them the moon? They'll always see us as the enemy." Grant slammed his hand on the desk, making Wilkes flinch. "They see us as the enemy because of people like you. This job isn't about power. It's about service. And until you understand that, you're a liability to this department." O'Connor sighed heavily, rubbing his temples. "You're being placed on administrative leave, effective immediately. There will be an internal investigation, and depending on the outcome, you may face criminal charges." Wilkes's eyes widened. "You're throwing me under the bus." "No, Darren," O'Connor said, his voice laced with disappointment. You drove yourself under it. A ripple effect. By the next morning, the fallout from the incident was unavoidable. News outlets across the country were covering the story, and Angela's face was on every channel. She had become an unwilling symbol of the broader fight for justice, a role she embraced not for herself, but for the community she loved. At the same time, protests erupted across Riverton. People from all walks of life, black, white, young, old, marched through the streets, their voices united in a demand for change. Signs bearing Angela's name and messages of solidarity filled the air, their slogans resonating far beyond the city's borders. At City Hall, Charles Carter worked tirelessly, meeting with council members and community leaders to push forward the reforms he and Angela had outlined. It wasn't easy. There was resistance from those who clung to the status quo, but Charles was determined. He knew that his wife's strength and the community's resolve would carry them through. And at the youth center, Angela continued her work, pouring her energy into the programs that had always been her passion. She knew the fight for systemic change would be long and arduous, but she also knew that real change began with the young people who walked through those doors. A glimmer of hope. One evening, as Angela was locking up the center, she noticed Malik waiting outside. He held a stack of flyers in his hands, his expression a mixture of nervousness and excitement. "Mrs. Carter," he began, "I've been working on something. A campaign to get more young people involved in the fight for justice. I thought maybe you could take a look." Angela smiled, her heart swelling with pride. "I'd be honored, Malik." As she read through the flyers, she couldn't help but feel a renewed sense of hope. The events of the past few days had been harrowing, but they had also ignited something powerful, a movement that could not be silenced. The road ahead would be long, but Angela knew they were no longer walking it alone. Together, they would rebuild East Briarwood, brick by brick, until it became a place where every voice was heard and every life valued. And for the first time in a long time, she believed that day would come. Seeds of resistance. The morning sun bathed East Briarwood in a golden glow, but the neighborhood buzzed with the energy of people who had no intention of waiting for the day to unfold naturally. The events of the past 48 hours had galvanized a fractured community into action. Angela Carter had become a symbol of resistance, and her fight had awakened a deep well of determination in those who had long felt silenced. At the community center, Angela prepared for another pivotal meeting. She was exhausted, both mentally and physically, but there was no room for rest. The viral video of her confrontation with Officer Wilkes had reached over 1 million views, attracting activists, journalists, and even national civil rights leaders to East Briarwood. Her phone buzzed incessantly with calls and messages, many offering support and others seeking interviews. Angela had declined most, choosing instead to focus on the grassroots movement taking shape in her neighborhood. "Mrs. Carter," Malik called as he entered the main hall, clutching a clipboard. His usual nervous energy was tempered by a newfound sense of purpose. "We've got everyone set up for the breakout sessions, and I finished drafting the youth mentorship program proposal. Do you think you could take a look later?" Angela turned to him with a tired but genuine smile. "Of course, Malik. You've been amazing through all of this. Thank you." Malik blushed slightly but stood taller. "I just want to help." The doors opened, and a flood of people began pouring into the hall. There were parents, students, small business owners, and even retirees who had seen the worst of East Briarwood's struggles and were ready to fight for something better. Sheila from the bakery arrived with trays of pastries, insisting that no one could organize on an empty stomach. Jamal Thompson, a former high school teacher turned activist, set up a booth in the corner with voter registration forms. Angela stepped to the front of the room, tapping the microphone to quiet the murmuring crowd. "Good morning, everyone," she began, her voice steady despite the butterflies in her stomach. "First, let me say thank you. Thank you for showing up, for caring, and for believing that we can create something better together." The crowd erupted into applause, But Angela held up her hand to bring them back to focus. We've made noise, and the world is watching. But now we have to decide what comes next. This isn't just about protests or headlines. This is about building something real, something lasting. Meanwhile, across town, at the Riverton Police Department, the atmosphere was equally tense, but for very different reasons. The internal investigation into Officer Wilkes's conduct was underway, and the department was under siege from both the media and public scrutiny. Detective Marcus Grant sat in a cramped conference room with Sergeant David O'Connor and Chief Laura Carter, a steely leader with a reputation for fairness. "We've reviewed the footage," Grant said, sliding a report across the table toward Chief Carter. "It's clear that Wilkes escalated the situation unnecessarily. His claims of Angela Carter resisting arrest are completely unfounded." Chief Carter glanced at the report, her face betraying little emotion. "What's the status of the community response?" O'Connor sighed. "They're furious, and rightfully so. Protests are ongoing, and Angela Carter is rallying people at the community center. It's becoming bigger than Wilkes. It's about systemic reform." Chief Carter leaned back in her chair, her gaze sharp. "And what about Wilkes? Has he said anything?" Grant shook his head. "He's defensive, claims he was just doing his job. But it's clear he's not grasping the larger picture." The chief let out a heavy sigh. "We're at a crossroads, gentlemen. If we don't handle this right, we're going to lose what little trust we have left with the community." Grant hesitated before speaking. "There's more, Chief. Angela Carter isn't just rallying for police reform. She's pushing for a civilian oversight board and greater community control over funding allocations. It's gaining traction." Chief Carter nodded slowly. "Then we have to act. Start by suspending Wilkes pending further investigation. And I want a public statement by the end of the day acknowledging our failures and committing to change." O'Connor raised an eyebrow. "That's a risky move, Chief." "Not doing it is riskier," she replied, her tone leaving no room for debate. "This isn't just about optics. It's about doing the right thing." Back at the community center, the breakout sessions had begun, and the room was abuzz with discussions. Each group tackled a different aspect of the movement: policy reform, community outreach, legal advocacy, and youth engagement. Angela moved from table to table, offering guidance and listening to ideas. She felt a swell of pride as she watched her neighbors take ownership of the fight. At one table, Malik led a group of teenagers in drafting a proposal for after-school programs that combined mentorship with skill-building workshops. Nearby, Sheila argued passionately for reallocating funds from the police budget to local businesses and mental health services. As Angela approached the table focused on police reform, she overheard Jamal Thompson speaking. "We need more than promises," he said firmly. "We need binding agreements, policies that can't just be reversed when this dies down." Angela nodded in agreement. "You're absolutely right, Jamal. And that's why we're not just pushing for reform. We're pushing for representation. A civilian oversight board with real authority can hold the department accountable." Jamal smiled at her. "You've got my vote, Mrs. Carter." Before Angela could respond, her phone buzzed. It was a call from Charles. She stepped into the hallway to answer, her heart sinking at the urgency in his voice. "Angela," he said, "Chief Carter just made a public statement. She's suspending Wilkes and committing to the creation of a task force to address community concerns." But what?" Angela pressed. "They're framing it as a department initiative, as if this all came from them," Charles explained. "They're trying to control the narrative." Angela's jaw tightened. "They don't get to rewrite the story. This isn't about them. It's about us." "Exactly," Charles said. "So what's the plan?" Angela's mind raced. "We keep building. We keep organizing. And we make sure they know this movement belongs to the people, not the system." The turning point. As the day turned into evening, Angela stood on the steps of the community center, addressing a crowd that had doubled in size since the morning. Candles flickered in the hands of the attendees, their light cutting through the encroaching darkness. "We've been here before," Angela said, her voice carrying over the crowd. "We've marched, we've chanted, and we've demanded change. But this time, it's different. This time, we're not stopping until we see it." The crowd erupted into cheers, their voices echoing through the streets. "This isn't just about me," Angela continued. "It's about every one of you who has faced injustice, who has been silenced, who has been told you don't matter. Today, we stand together to say, we do matter, and we will be heard." The energy was electric, the crowd galvanized by Angela's words. In that moment, East Briarwood was no longer a neighborhood on the margins. It was the epicenter of a movement that was growing stronger by the hour. And Angela knew, as she looked out at the sea of determined faces, that they were only just beginning. The reckoning. The city of Riverton was transforming before their eyes. What had started as a single act of injustice on Harmony Avenue was now a groundswell of change rippling through every corner of the city. Angela Carter stood at the helm of this transformation, but the road was far from smooth. For every victory, there were obstacles, both expected and unforeseen. On a crisp, clear morning, Angela stepped out of her home to find a group of reporters camped outside, cameras at the ready. The media attention was relentless, and while it amplified her message, it also brought new challenges. Her every move was scrutinized, her words dissected. But Angela had no time for hesitation. Today was crucial. She climbed into her husband Charles's car, where he waited with a stack of papers in the passenger seat. "Ready?" he asked, glancing at her. Angela adjusted her scarf and nodded. "As ready as I'll ever be." The two were headed to City Hall for a pivotal meeting. Over the past week, Angela and her team had drafted a comprehensive reform plan that addressed not only policing, but also the systemic inequities that plagued East Briarwood. The proposal included reallocating funds toward education, mental health services, and affordable housing, alongside the establishment of a civilian oversight board for the police department. Charles glanced at her as he drove. "You know they'll push back on this. The council isn't exactly known for embracing radical change." Angela smiled faintly. "That's why we're not just going to present the plan. We're going to show them why it's necessary." Charles raised an eyebrow. "How?" Angela gestured to the papers. "Data, personal stories, community support. They can't ignore the numbers or the people." The meeting. City Hall was a hive of activity as Angela and Charles entered the council chambers. The room was packed. Council members sat in their usual spots, but the gallery was filled with community members, activists, and journalists. Angela felt the weight of their expectations, but she also drew strength from their presence. Councilwoman Patricia Green, one of Angela's few allies on the council, smiled warmly as Angela approached the podium. "Mrs. Carter, you have the floor." Angela began by presenting the data: crime rates, police expenditures, community poverty levels, and the glaring disparities between East Briarwood and the rest of Riverton. Each statistic painted a picture of systemic neglect and mismanagement. But it was when Angela shifted to personal stories that the room truly began to listen. She shared Malik's story, how he had grown up feeling alienated from a system that seemed designed to fail him, only to find hope and purpose through the youth center. She recounted Sheila's struggle to keep her bakery afloat amid rising rents and declining foot traffic, and how a single incident of police overreach had nearly driven her out of business. "These aren't just numbers or anecdotes," Angela said, her voice steady but impassioned. "These are lives. These are our neighbors, our children, our future. And every day we fail to act, we're complicit in the harm being done." Councilman Roger Avery, a staunch opponent of police reform, leaned forward. "Mrs. Carter, while I appreciate your passion, reallocating police funds is a risky proposition. How do you plan to address the potential rise in crime?" Angela met his gaze unflinchingly. "By addressing its root causes. Crime doesn't happen in a vacuum, Councilman Avery. It's fueled by poverty, lack of education, and limited opportunities. If we invest in our community, we reduce the need for excessive policing." The room erupted into murmurs, some supportive, others skeptical. Avery opened his mouth to respond, but before he could, Malik rose from his seat in the gallery. "Can I say something?" Malik's voice was steady, but the room went silent, all eyes on him. Green gestured for him to proceed. "Go ahead." Malik stepped forward, his tall frame almost trembling with emotion. "I grew up in East Briarwood. I saw my friends get stopped by the police just for walking home from school. I saw businesses close because no one believed in us. And I saw Mrs. Carter build something from nothing, a youth center that saved kids like me. If you really care about this city, you'll stop fighting us and start helping us." The room erupted into applause, and Angela felt a surge of pride. Malik had captured the heart of their movement in a way no statistic ever could. A brewing storm. While the council deliberated, the streets of Riverton remained charged. Protests continued daily, and tensions with the police department were at an all-time high. Detective Marcus Grant had become an unlikely ally, working behind the scenes to bridge the gap between the department and the community. Grant's efforts were not without resistance. Many officers, emboldened by unions and the law and order rhetoric of some city officials, saw Angela and her supporters as adversaries. Among the most vocal was Officer Darren Wilkes, whose suspension had only fueled his bitterness. In a dimly lit bar on the outskirts of town, Wilkes nursed a drink and scowled at the television as it displayed footage of Angela's speech at City Hall. Around him, a small group of like-minded officers muttered in agreement. "She's tearing this city apart," one officer growled. "And for what?" A few headlines. Wilkes slammed his glass on the table. "It's not just headlines. She's trying to dismantle everything we've built. And the department's letting her." A younger officer, his expression uncertain, spoke hesitantly. "But what if she's right? What if things do need to change?" Wilkes glared at him. "Don't fall for their sob stories. They're using us as scapegoats, and we're just sitting here taking it." The conversation grew heated, and while most of the officers eventually dispersed, Wilkes remained, stewing in his resentment. His anger was a dangerous fuel, and Angela was unaware that she was at the center of his growing obsession. A moment of respite. Back at the community center, Angela returned to find Malik and Sheila waiting for her with updates. The youth mentorship program had gained traction, and local businesses were beginning to pledge support for the reform plan. "Mrs. Carter," Malik said as she sat down, "you're really making them listen. But are you okay? You've been going nonstop." Angela smiled wearily. "I'm fine, Malik. This fight is bigger than my exhaustion." Sheila placed a hand on Angela's shoulder. "You're not alone in this. Remember that. We've got your back." Angela nodded, gratitude welling up in her chest. For the first time in days, she allowed herself a moment to breathe. The road ahead was long, but the seeds of change had been planted. Now it was up to all of them to nurture those seeds and ensure they bore fruit. As Angela looked out at the community center, bustling with activity and hope, she knew one thing for certain. Riverton would never be the same. A new dawn. The day of the vote had finally arrived. City Hall was teeming with people from all walks of life. Activists, business owners, clergy, students, and even former skeptics who had been moved by the relentless passion of Angela Carter and her supporters. The energy in the room was electric, buzzing with equal parts anticipation and apprehension. Angela stood at the back of the chamber, watching as the city council members filed in one by one. Each carried the weight of the decision they were about to make, knowing that their choice would shape Riverton's future. At her side, Malik, Sheila, and Charles offered quiet words of encouragement. Malik clutched a stack of petitions with thousands of signatures supporting the reform package, a testament to the community's overwhelming demand for change. Charles leaned close, his voice low. "Whatever happens today, you've already won. You've shown this city what's possible." Angela smiled faintly. "It's not about me, Charles. It's about all of us. And it's about what comes next. The vote. The council meeting began with the usual procedural formalities, but the tension in the air was palpable. Councilwoman Patricia Green, the strongest advocate for Angela's reform plan, was the first to speak. She outlined the key components of the proposal: the creation of a civilian oversight board, a reallocation of police funds toward community programs, and new accountability measures for law enforcement. "This is not about defunding the police," Green emphasized, her voice clear and measured. "It's about redefining public safety. It's about investing in people, in neighborhoods, and in opportunities that prevent crime before it begins." Councilman Roger Avery, the leading opponent of the plan, was next to speak. His tone was sharp, laced with skepticism. "While I understand the frustration of our community, I have serious concerns about the implications of this plan. Reallocating funds from the police budget could compromise public safety at a time when crime rates are already too high." The gallery erupted into murmurs, some in agreement but most in opposition. Malik's voice cut through the noise. "How can you talk about safety when people like me have to fear the very people who are supposed to protect us?" Avery shot him a glare. "This is a council meeting, young man. You're out of order." Malik didn't back down. "And you're out of touch." The crowd erupted into applause, forcing Avery to sit down, his face flushed with embarrassment. Angela placed a steadying hand on Malik's shoulder, whispering, "Let them finish. Our time will come." Angela's testimony. When it was Angela's turn to speak, the room fell silent. She approached the podium with her usual poise, but there was a fire in her eyes that commanded attention. "Good afternoon, council members," she began. "You've heard the numbers, the stories, and the proposals, but I want to remind you what this vote is really about. It's about people. It's about restoring trust. And it's about ensuring that no one else in this city has to endure what I did." She paused, scanning the room. "When Officer Wilkes assaulted me, it wasn't just a personal attack. It was an attack on this entire community. It was a reminder of the systemic failures that have plagued Riverton for decades. But what happened afterward, the outpouring of support, the organizing, the demands for justice, that was a reminder of our collective strength." Angela's voice grew stronger as she continued. "This plan isn't a threat to public safety. It's an investment in it. It's a commitment to addressing the root causes of crime, poverty, lack of education, and inequality. It's a promise to build a city where everyone feels safe, valued, and heard." The applause that followed was thunderous, reverberating through the chamber. Even some of the council members who had been on the fence looked visibly moved. The decision. As the council prepared to vote, the tension in the room was almost unbearable. Patricia Green cast the first vote. Yes. Roger Avery followed with a predictable no. The votes continued, each one feeling like a lifetime. When the final vote was cast, the result was clear. The reform plan had passed by a narrow margin. The gallery erupted into cheers, people hugging and clapping as tears streamed down their faces. Malik jumped to his feet, shouting, "We did it. We actually did it." Angela closed her eyes for a moment, allowing herself to feel the weight of the victory. When she opened them, she saw Charles beaming at her. "You did it," he whispered, pulling her into a tight embrace. "No," Angela replied, her voice thick with emotion. "We did it." The fallout. While the victory was significant, it was also the beginning of a new chapter, one filled with challenges. The police union immediately issued a statement condemning the reforms, and some officers threatened to resign. The media painted the decision as both a groundbreaking win for civil rights and a dangerous gamble for public safety. Detective Marcus Grant, now a key figure in implementing the reforms, addressed his fellow officers in a tense meeting. "This isn't about choosing sides," he told them. "It's about doing our jobs better. If you're not willing to adapt, maybe this isn't the job for you." Grant's words carried weight, and while some officers left the force, many stayed, committed to rebuilding trust with the community. A new beginning. Months later, Riverton was already beginning to change. The Civilian Oversight Board was up and running, staffed by a diverse group of community leaders, activists, and legal experts. Funding for the youth center had doubled, allowing Angela to expand its programs and reach even more kids. Officer Darren Wilkes, following the internal investigation, resigned from the force. He faded into obscurity, a stark reminder of the old guard Riverton was leaving behind. Malik, inspired by the movement he helped ignite, launched a citywide youth coalition aimed at empowering young people to take an active role in shaping their communities. He often joked that Angela was his unofficial campaign manager, but the pride in his voice was unmistakable. On a warm spring evening, the community gathered at the newly renovated Briarwood Park for a celebration. Families picnicked on the grass, kids played on the new equipment, and a local band filled the air with music. Angela stood on the small stage, looking out at the crowd. "This is what change looks like," she said, her voice carrying over the laughter and music. "It's not just about policies or votes. It's about people coming together, refusing to give up on each other, and building something better." As the crowd cheered, Angela felt a profound sense of hope. Riverton still had a long way to go, but it was moving forward. And for the first time in a long time, the city's future felt bright. Legacy in the making. As Angela stepped down from the stage, the warmth of the crowd's cheers lingered in the air. People from all corners of Riverton approached her, offering handshakes, hugs, and words of gratitude. Each face reminded her why she had fought so hard, why the fight wasn't just hers but belonged to the entire community. Malik found her amid the throng, his expression a mixture of pride and awe. "Mrs. Carter," he began, "I've been thinking, maybe one day I could do what you do. Speak up for people. Lead something bigger." Angela smiled, placing a hand on his shoulder. "You already are, Malik. The way you've stepped up over these past months, the way you've inspired others. You're already a leader. Keep following that path, and you'll go further than you ever imagined." Malik nodded, his confidence bolstered by her words. "I'll make you proud." "You already have," she replied, her voice soft but full of conviction, a glimpse of healing. As the sun dipped below the horizon, Angela and Charles walked hand in hand through the park. The evening air carried a gentle breeze, and for the first time in months, Angela allowed herself to relax. "You know," Charles said, breaking the silence, "this isn't just a victory for the city, it's a victory for us too. We've faced so much together, and somehow, you've made me believe in something I didn't think was possible. Real, lasting change." Angela smiled up at him. "It's not just me, Charles. It's everyone who refused to stay silent, who believed we could do better. I just had the privilege of being their voice." They paused near the new community mural, a vibrant depiction of East Briarwood's resilience and diversity. At the center was a figure that unmistakably resembled Angela, holding hands with children of all backgrounds beneath the words, "Together, we rise." Angela's breath caught in her throat. "I didn't know they were doing this," she whispered, her voice thick with emotion. Charles squeezed her hand. "They'd wanted to surprise you. It's their way of saying thank you." As they stood there, reflecting on everything they had endured, Angela felt an overwhelming sense of gratitude. The scars of the past were still there, but they no longer defined the city. Riverton was healing, not perfectly, not quickly, but steadily. And that was enough. The future unfolds. The reforms passed by the city council began to take root, and while the road was not without obstacles, progress was undeniable. The Civilian Oversight Board proved instrumental in holding the police department accountable, ensuring transparency and fairness in every action. Officers like Detective Marcus Grant became champions of the new era, bridging the gap between law enforcement and the community. The Youth Center, now a hub of activity, expanded its programs to include job training, mental health support, and leadership workshops. Angela often found herself mentoring young leaders like Malik, watching as they stepped into roles of responsibility with passion and purpose. Sheila's bakery flourished, thanks in part to the city's new small business grants. Her peach cobbler became a symbol of comfort and perseverance, a reminder that even the simplest acts could contribute to a community's revival. A farewell to the fight, but not the mission. A year after the reforms passed, Angela stood before another crowd, this time at a ceremony dedicating the newly renamed Carter Community Center. The honor was unexpected, but it reflected the gratitude of a city transformed by her leadership. As she stepped to the podium, Angela looked out at the faces of her neighbors, her friends, her family. "This center isn't about me," she began, her voice steady. "It's about what we've built together. It's about the power of hope, resilience, and community. And it's a reminder that even in the face of injustice, we have the ability to create something beautiful." The applause was deafening, but Angela felt a quiet peace within herself. She had fought the good fight, and though the work was far from finished, she knew it was in capable hands. Epilogue. The dawn of a new era. Years later, Riverton had become a model city for reform. Its transformation was studied, praised, and emulated by communities across the country. Angela, now retired from public life, spent her days mentoring young activists and writing about her experiences. Her memoir, Together, We Rise, became a bestseller, inspiring countless others to take up the mantle of change. Malik, now a city councilman, often visited Angela for advice. On one such visit, he looked at her with the same fire she had seen in his eyes years ago. "Mrs. Carter," he said, "do you think we'll ever really finish this fight?" Angela smiled, her gaze wise and unwavering. "The fight for justice never truly ends, Malik. But every step we take brings us closer to the world we want to see. And as long as there are people like you, I know we'll keep moving forward." As Malik left, Angela sat on her porch, watching the sun set over a city that was once broken but now brimmed with hope. She knew the work was far from over, but for the first time in her life, she felt that Riverton's future was in good hands. And as the first stars appeared in the night sky, Angela whispered to herself, "Together, we rise."